The red dust of Ouagadougou swirled in the late afternoon heat as Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped from his vehicle. His military boots crunched against the gravel outside the modest community center where elders had gathered. The scent of burning wood mixed with the distant sound of children playing, creating the familiar symphony of his homeland. Today was meant to be a routine visit to discuss agricultural reforms with local leaders. But fate had different plans, as it often does when truth seeks its moment. The weathered faces of the elders carried stories spanning decades, their eyes holding wisdom that no university could teach. As Ibrahim approached the circle of plastic chairs under the baobab tree, he noticed an unfamiliar figure among them. The stranger was a young American man, perhaps in his 30s, with earnest eyes and a nervous energy that seemed out of place. He wore simple khaki pants and a white cotton shirt, already showing patches of sweat despite the shade. When their eyes met, something flickered in the American's expression. Recognition mixed with something deeper, more complex. "Captain Traoré," the village chief said in Moore, gesturing toward the visitor, "this young man has been asking many questions about our history." The translator whispered urgently in French, explaining that the American claimed to be researching African development stories. Ibrahim felt his instincts sharpen. In his experience, Western researchers often came with predetermined narratives. This one seemed different, carrying a weight of personal burden rather than academic curiosity. The American rose awkwardly from his chair, extending a trembling hand toward Ibrahim. "Captain, my name is—" He paused, swallowing hard. "My name is David, but everyone back home knows me as Charlie Kirk." The admission hung in the air like smoke from the evening cooking fires. Ibrahim's expression remained composed, but his mind raced through connections and possibilities. He had heard that name before, associated with American conservative politics and vocal opinions about Africa. Yet here stood a man whose voice carried none of the confidence Ibrahim had witnessed in online videos. The elders watched this exchange with the patient attention they reserved for moments when destinies intersect. Something significant was unfolding under their sacred tree, something that would demand truth from all parties involved. Charlie's hands shook as he looked directly into Ibrahim's eyes, the weight of unspoken secrets pressing against his chest. "Captain, I've come a very long way to tell you something that my handlers, my producers, my entire network would destroy me for revealing." The words carried the gravity of confession, each syllable carefully chosen and heavy with consequence. Ibrahim remained silent, allowing the space for truth that his leadership style had cultivated through years of listening to his people. The baobab's ancient branches seemed to lean closer, as if the tree itself understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. In that moment, under the African sky painted with the colors of approaching dusk, two worlds were about to collide in ways that neither man could have anticipated. The silence stretched between them, pregnant with the possibility of revelations that could reshape narratives on both sides of the ocean. Charlie's voice cracked as he began to unravel the threads of a story buried beneath years of manufactured narratives. "My real name is David Kirkpatrick, and my grandfather was Colonel James Kirkpatrick, stationed in Upper Volta in 1960. The elderly chief's eyes widened with recognition, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair. Ibrahim felt the air grow heavy, with the weight of historical ghosts suddenly made manifest. The other elders began murmuring among themselves in Moore, their voices carrying tones of remembrance and old pain. In the distance, the call to evening prayer echoed across Ouagadougou, but here under the baobab, time seemed suspended. Charlie's confession had opened a door to the past that many had hoped would remain forever sealed. The village chief spoke slowly in French, his words deliberate and measured like stones dropped into still water. "Colonel Kirkpatrick. Yes, we remember him well. He made promises to our fathers about independence, about respect. Ibrahim watched as Charlie's face contorted with shame. The comfortable persona of the confident American commentator completely stripped away. The truth was written in the lines around the old chief's eyes, in the way his voice carried both sorrow and strength. "Your grandfather took something from us that was never his to take," the chief continued, his gaze never leaving Charlie's face. The younger man nodded, tears beginning to trace paths down his dust-covered cheeks. This was not the Africa he had described in his political commentary, sanitized and distant. Ibrahim leaned forward, his military training allowing him to read the complex emotions playing across both men's faces. "What did he take?" he asked quietly, though something in his soldier's intuition already suggested the answer. Charlie reached into his worn leather satchel and withdrew a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, his hands trembling as he placed it on the ground between them. "Sacred items," Charlie whispered, "ceremonial pieces that belonged to the resistance fighters who opposed French colonial rule." The chief's breath caught audibly, and several elders rose from their chairs, moving closer to examine the bundle. These were artifacts that had been mourned as lost for over 6 decades, pieces of their cultural soul that had vanished during the chaos of independence. The weight of this revelation settled over the gathering like the approaching African night. "But there's more," Charlie said, his voice barely above a whisper, as the magnitude of his family's secret began to fully emerge. "My grandfather didn't just take these items as souvenirs. He was part of a deliberate operation to discredit the independence movement." Ibrahim's jaw tightened as the implications became clear, understanding now why this young American had traveled so far to seek redemption. The elders' faces reflected a complex mixture of vindication and grief, finally learning the truth behind betrayals they had long suspected. Charlie looked up at Ibrahim with eyes full of desperate honesty, knowing that his next words would change everything. "Captain, everything I've said publicly about Africa, every narrative I've pushed about dependency and failure—" He paused, gathering courage from depths he didn't know he possessed. "It was all built on lies my family has been perpetuating for 3 generations. The baobab tree stood witness as truth finally broke free from decades of deliberate silence. The weight of Charlie's confession settled over the gathering like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. Ibrahim studied the young American's face, recognizing the particular agony that comes when one's entire worldview crumbles. "Tell us about the silencing," Ibrahim said, his voice carrying the authority of a leader who had faced his own moments of devastating truth. Charlie wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving streaks in the dust that had accumulated on his face. The elders remained motionless, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a moment when lies finally surrender to truth. In the distance, evening cooking fires began to flicker to life, sending thin columns of smoke into the darkening sky. The baobab's ancient presence seemed to offer sanctuary for words that had been imprisoned for too long. "When I first started in media, I wanted to tell different stories," Charlie began, his voice gaining strength as confession became catharsis. "I had researched my grandfather's journals, found evidence of the theft, the manipulation, the deliberate sabotage of African initiatives." Ibrahim nodded slowly, having seen how Western narratives consistently portrayed African struggles without acknowledging Western complicity. "But my producers, my network executives, they had different plans for me," Charlie continued, his hands clenching into fists. The chief translated quietly for the elders who didn't speak French, their faces reflecting decades of experience with such betrayals. "They told me that complex narratives don't sell, that audiences wanted simple stories about African failure and American solutions." The irony was bitter. He had become the voice promoting the very lies his discoveries had exposed. His rise to prominence had been built on perpetuating his grandfather's colonial deceptions. The evening air carried the sound of distant drums from a neighboring compound, rhythms that had survived centuries of attempts to silence them. Every time I tried to introduce nuance, to mention the historical context, to give credit where it was due, Charlie's voice trailed off. Ibrahim watched as the younger man struggled with the memory of his own moral compromises. The network would edit it out, or they'd threaten to cancel my show, cut my platform entirely. The elders exchanged knowing looks, having witnessed how power structures maintain themselves through selective storytelling. They said I was becoming too sympathetic to anti-American narratives. Charlie laughed bitterly at the phrase. The chief's weathered face showed no surprise. This was an old story, told in new ways across generations. Power had always demanded that certain truths remain buried beneath convenient fictions. "So you became their perfect spokesperson," Ibrahim said, not with judgment, but with the understanding of someone who had faced his own impossible choices. Charlie nodded miserably, recognizing that Ibrahim grasped the full tragedy of his situation without condemnation. "I told myself I could change things from the inside, that I could gradually shift the narrative," he admitted. The hypocrisy of his position had eaten at him for years, privately knowing the truth while publicly promoting its opposite. But every compromise made the next one easier, until I couldn't recognize myself anymore. The drums in the distance seemed to grow louder, as if the entire community was awakening to witness this reckoning. "Captain, I've spent years silencing the very voice that could have honored my grandfather's victims instead of perpetuating his crimes." The confession hung in the air like smoke, finally free after years of imprisonment within Charlie's conscience. Ibrahim rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the edge of the gathering, his silhouette framed against the deepening orange sky. The weight of Charlie's revelations required the kind of careful consideration that had made him a leader his people trusted. When he turned back to face the group, his expression held the composed strength that had carried Burkina Faso through its most challenging moments. "Charlie," he said, using the name the world knew rather than the birth name buried beneath layers of manufactured identity. "You speak of silencing as if it was something done only to you, but you became part of a system that has silenced us for generations." His words carried no malice, only the patient authority of someone who had learned to speak truth regardless of its convenience. The elders nodded in recognition of their captain's wisdom, understanding that this moment required African perspective, not Western guilt. "In your country, you debate whether we are capable of self-governance while sitting in buildings constructed with wealth extracted from our soil," Ibrahim continued. The flickering light from nearby compounds cast dancing shadows across his face as he spoke. "You analyze our failures without mentioning the debt structures that strangle our economies, the trade agreements that favor your corporations." Charlie listened with the intensity of a student, finally hearing lessons he should have learned years ago. "Your grandfather didn't just steal artifacts. He participated in stealing our narrative, our right to tell our own story." The chief translated Ibrahim's words into Moray, and several elders made sounds of agreement, their voices adding depth to the captain's testimony. "Every time you appeared on television promoting the idea that we need saving, you were completing your grandfather's work." The truth of this statement settled over Charlie like a physical weight he could finally acknowledge. The sound of evening prayers drifted across the compound, mingling with the voices of children calling to each other in the gathering darkness. "But here is what your networks never allowed you to say," Ibrahim said, moving closer to where Charlie sat, hunched in his chair. "We have been solving our own problems for centuries, long before European contact, and we continue to do so despite ongoing interference." His voice carried the pride of a people who had never truly been conquered, only temporarily overwhelmed. "When we removed the French military from our territory, we didn't collapse into chaos, as your experts predicted." The elders smiled at this reference to their recent victory, remembering how Western media had forecasted disaster. Instead, we found our own path, made our own alliances, fed our own people. Charlie looked up at Ibrahim with something approaching awe, finally seeing the man behind the Western caricatures he had helped create. The perspective you were never allowed to share is that African dignity has never depended on Western approval, Ibrahim concluded. His words carried the finality of truth that no debate could diminish or qualification could soften. We don't need your pity, your charity, or your salvation. We need your respect and your honesty. The captain's gaze held steady on Charlie's face, offering neither forgiveness nor condemnation, but something more valuable: recognition of shared humanity. Your grandfather's theft was not just of objects, but of our right to be seen as equals rather than subjects. The evening air seemed to carry this declaration beyond the compound, into the streets of Ouagadougou and across the vast African continent. Now you have a choice: continue perpetuating his lies or help restore what he stole, not just the artifacts, but the narrative. In that moment, under the infinite African sky, Charlie understood that redemption would require more than confession. It would demand action. The village chief's ancient hands trembled as he carefully unwrapped the sacred bundle Charlie had brought, revealing intricate bronze ceremonial masks and carved ivory pieces that seemed to glow in the firelight. "These belonged to the Resistance Council of 1960, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion as memories flooded back across 6 decades. Ibrahim watched the elder's face transform, years seeming to fall away as he touched artifacts he thought he would never see again. "But there was something else your grandfather took," the chief continued, looking directly at Charlie with eyes that held both pain and hope. "He took a promise that was made in blood and witnessed by the ancestors." The other elders leaned forward, understanding that they were about to hear the completion of a story that had haunted their community for generations. Charlie felt his heart racing, sensing that this revelation would be the most damaging yet. The chief's voice grew stronger as he spoke, drawing power from the sacred objects now returned to their rightful place. "Colonel Kirkpatrick was present during the secret negotiations between our resistance leaders and certain American officials in 1959. Ibrahim's military training helped him immediately grasp the implications. This wasn't just about colonial theft, but about broken international commitments. Your government promised support for our independence movement in exchange for mining rights and strategic positioning against Soviet influence." The drums from distant compounds seemed to grow quieter, as if the entire city was straining to hear this long-buried truth. But when the French threatened to withdraw completely and leave chaos, your grandfather convinced his superiors to abandon us. Charlie's face went pale as he realized the scope of his family's betrayal extended far beyond stolen artifacts. The weapons that never came, the technical assistance that vanished, the diplomatic support that evaporated, all because of reports your grandfather filed. "Show him the document," one of the elderly women said in Moore, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the consequences of that betrayal. The chief reached into his robes and withdrew a yellowed paper, carefully unfolding what appeared to be an official correspondence. Charlie's hands shook as he recognized his grandfather's military letterhead and distinctive handwriting, describing African leaders as unreliable and communist sympathizers. The letter recommended that American support be redirected to more stable French-aligned candidates who would be easier to control. "This letter reached Washington 3 days before our independence celebration," the chief explained, his voice heavy with the weight of historical injustice. "Within a week, every promise your government had made to us was quietly withdrawn." The magnitude of this betrayal left Charlie speechless, understanding now that his grandfather had not just stolen objects, but had stolen his people's future. Ibrahim placed a firm hand on Charlie's shoulder, feeling the younger man's body shake with the enormity of what he was learning. This is why your media narrative has always portrayed African independence as chaos, he said with quiet intensity. Because acknowledging our legitimate grievances would expose promises your country made and deliberately broke. The sacred artifacts seemed to witness this moment of truth, their return coinciding with the revelation of deeper wounds that had never properly healed. Your grandfather didn't just take from us, he convinced your government that we were unworthy of what had already been promised. Charlie looked up at Ibrahim through tears, finally understanding that his public career had been built on perpetuating the very lies that justified his grandfather's betrayal. Every time I spoke about African dependency and dysfunction, I was covering up this broken promise, he whispered. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just been silenced, he had become the instrument of that silencing. Ibrahim studied the yellow document in the flickering firelight, his trained eye catching details that revealed the broader conspiracy behind his grandfather's betrayal. Charlie, this letter mentions coordination with French intelligence and British mining interests, he said, his voice carrying the weight of strategic understanding. The implications stretched far beyond Burkina Faso, touching every corner of the African continent where similar promises had been made and broken. Your grandfather wasn't operating alone. This was part of a systematic effort to maintain Western control while appearing to support independence. The elders listened intently as Ibrahim connected historical dots they had sensed but never fully understood. Charlie felt a crushing realization that his family's crime was just one thread in a vast web of international deception. The sacred artifacts seemed to bear witness not just to local injustice, but to a global pattern of betrayal that continued to shape world politics. The chief pointed to specific names mentioned in the correspondence, recognizing some as officials who had later become prominent in international development organizations. These same people went on to design the aid programs that kept us dependent, he said with bitter clarity. Ibrahim nodded, understanding how perfectly the system had been engineered to perpetuate the very problems it claimed to solve. They created the crisis, then positioned themselves as the solution, he explained to Charlie, whose media training had never exposed him to these connections. The drums in the distance seemed to carry messages across the compound, as if the entire community sensed that momentous truths were being revealed. This is why every African leader who challenges the system faces the same accusations: corruption, instability, anti-Western sentiment. Charlie recognized the talking points he had used countless times, finally seeing them as weapons rather than analysis. The global stakes were becoming terrifyingly clear. What you're describing isn't just historical injustice, Charlie said, his voice hoarse with the weight of comprehension. It's an ongoing operation that requires people like me to maintain the narrative. Ibrahim's eyes reflected the firelight as he studied the American's face, seeing genuine awakening rather than performative guilt. Every time African leaders succeed without Western approval, it threatens to expose the entire system, the captain explained. The elderly woman who had demanded the document be shown now spoke in rapid Mooré, her words translated as urgent warnings. She says that revealing this truth will make you a target of the same forces that silenced your conscience, the chief interpreted. Charlie understood that his journey toward redemption would come with consequences his comfortable media career had never prepared him for. The global machinery of narrative control would not tolerate his defection without retaliation. The sound of motorcycles approaching the compound interrupted their conversation, causing Ibrahim's security instincts to sharpen immediately. "Captain, we should move this discussion inside," one of his aides suggested quietly, recognizing that sensitive conversations in public spaces could have dangerous consequences. Charlie looked around nervously, suddenly aware that his presence here represented more than personal redemption. It was an act of potential treason against systems that had invested heavily in his compliance. "If I tell this story publicly, it won't just end my career," he said, the reality of his situation finally crystallizing. Ibrahim placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, recognizing the courage it would take to choose truth over comfort. "The stakes are global because the lies are global," he said simply. "But truth has a power that transcends any network or government." The artifacts gleamed in the firelight, silent witnesses to the moment when personal reckoning met international consequence. As they moved into the modest community center, the sound of approaching footsteps revealed not motorcycles, but a group of local women carrying steaming bowls of food. The eldest among them, her grey hair wrapped in colorful fabric, set down her burden and studied Charlie with the penetrating gaze of someone who had witnessed decades of Western visitors. "Grandmother Aminata has something to say," the chief announced respectfully, switching to Mure as the old woman began speaking in rapid, passionate tones. Ibrahim translated for Charlie, whose limited French couldn't capture the nuanced wisdom flowing from her weathered lips. "She says that in 1960, she was a young woman working as a translator for the independence negotiations your grandfather observed. The revelation that this living witness had been present during those crucial moments sent chills down Charlie's spine. Her presence transformed abstract historical documents into lived human experience, making the past suddenly immediate and undeniable. Grandmother Aminata continued speaking, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of traditional storytelling, while other community members gathered quietly around the edges of the room. "She remembers your grandfather," Ibrahim translated, his own expression growing more intense as he processed her words. "She says he seemed different from the other American officials, younger, more nervous, asking many questions about traditional leadership structures." Charlie leaned forward, desperate to understand every nuance of this eyewitness testimony that could fill gaps his grandfather's journals had left empty. But she also noticed that he was taking detailed notes about our weaknesses, our internal disagreements, information that later appeared in French intelligence reports. The old woman's eyes never left Charlie's face as she spoke, as if she were reading his soul while sharing her memories. "She says she warned the resistance leaders that this young American was not what he appeared to be. The weight of her prophetic wisdom, ignored by men who had paid the price for that dismissal, filled the room with palpable tension. Other elders began sharing their own fragments of memory, creating a collective testimony that revealed the full scope of the betrayal Charlie was only beginning to comprehend. "My father was one of the fighters whose names appeared on your grandfather's list," said a middle-aged man who had entered quietly during Grandmother Aminata's recollection. Ibrahim translated rapidly as more voices joined the conversation, each adding pieces to a puzzle that exposed systematic surveillance and manipulation. They knew exactly which leaders to target for elimination, which communities would resist French withdrawal, which traditional authorities could be bribed or threatened. No, Charlie felt overwhelmed by the realization that his grandfather had essentially mapped the entire independence movement for hostile foreign powers. "Your grandfather didn't just steal artifacts," Ibrahim said, his voice heavy with the accumulated weight of these testimonies. The community's wisdom revealed that Colonel Kirkpatrick had been far more than an opportunistic thief. He had been an intelligence operative whose work had cost lives. The room fell silent as Grandmother Aminata approached Charlie directly, placing her weathered hands on either side of his face while speaking in gentle but firm tones. "She says that the ancestors brought you here not for punishment, but for healing," Ibrahim translated, his own voice softening with surprise at her merciful words. "She can see your grandfather's guilt written in your features, but also your own pain at carrying his burden." Charlie felt tears streaming down his cheeks as this elderly African woman, whose people had been betrayed by his family, offered him something he had never expected, forgiveness paired with responsibility. But she also says that forgiveness without action is meaningless, Ibrahim continued, the elder's wisdom cutting straight to the heart of Charlie's moral dilemma. The community's knowledge of what truly happened has been preserved through oral tradition, waiting for the day when someone would be brave enough to help them tell the world. The collective wisdom of the elders surrounded Charlie like an embrace, but also like a challenge he could no longer avoid. Their patient preservation of truth across 6 decades now demanded his courage to amplify their voices beyond this sacred space. The weight of 60 years of suppressed testimony hung heavy in the air as Charlie rose slowly from his chair, his decision crystallizing with each breath. The community center had filled with more people, word having spread through the compound that something significant was unfolding under their roof. Ibrahim watched the transformation in Charlie's posture, recognizing the moment when a man stops running from his destiny and turns to face it. "I need to make a phone call," Charlie said, his voice steady for the first time since his arrival in Ouagadougou. The elders exchanged glances, understanding that they were witnessing the precise moment when silence would finally be broken. Grandmother Aminata nodded approvingly, her ancient eyes reflecting satisfaction that truth was finally choosing courage over comfort. The sacred artifacts seemed to pulse with energy, as if the spirits of the resistance fighters were awakening to witness justice. Charlie pulled out his satellite phone, its modern technology seeming incongruous in the traditional setting where truth was being born. "I'm calling my producer live on air," he announced, causing Ibrahim to raise an eyebrow at the audacity of the plan. The community members who understood English began translating for others, creating a wave of excited murmurs throughout the room. "They'll try to cut me off, but I'm going to stream this simultaneously on multiple platforms," Charlie continued, his media expertise finally serving truth instead of deception. Ibrahim felt a surge of respect for this young American who was choosing to destroy his comfortable life for the sake of justice. The chief began gathering the sacred artifacts, preparing to display them as evidence of the crimes Charlie was about to confess. The moment of truth had arrived with the sudden force of a thunderstorm, and there would be no retreat from the consequences. The phone connection crackled to life, and Charlie's producer's voice filled the room with the casual confidence of someone who assumed complete control over the narrative. "Charlie, we've got you scheduled for the Africa segment in 10 minutes. Remember, keep it focused on the dependency narrative we discussed." Ibrahim watched Charlie's face harden with resolve as he prepared to shatter his handler's expectations completely. "Actually, Marcus, I'm going live right now with a story that's going to change everything we've ever said about Africa," Charlie announced. The stunned silence from the phone was broken only by the producer's panicked voice. "Charlie, what are you talking about? You can't go off script like this." The elders leaned forward, understanding that they were witnessing the exact moment when decades of careful control began to crumble. Grandmother Aminata smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had waited patiently for justice and finally seen it arrive. "I'm not going off script, Marcus," Charlie said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I'm finally telling the truth about my family's role in suppressing African independence movements." The phone erupted with shouted warnings and threats, but Charlie had already begun streaming live to his social media platforms. Ibrahim positioned himself beside Charlie, his presence lending authority to the testimony that was about to reshape international understanding. "My grandfather, Colonel James Kirkpatrick, was not just a witness to African independence. He was an agent of its sabotage." The producer's desperate attempts to maintain control were now audible to the entire gathering, creating a real-time demonstration of how truth gets suppressed. The community watched in amazement as decades of their silenced voices suddenly found amplification through the very media systems that had previously excluded them. The moment of truth had become unstoppable, streaming live across the globe from a simple community center in Ouagadougou. Within minutes of Charlie's live confession, his phone began buzzing with notifications as the stream gained momentum across social media platforms. Ibrahim watched the real-time viewer count climb exponentially, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the digital age. 30,000 viewers and climbing, Charlie announced, his voice mixing excitement with terror at the magnitude of what he had unleashed. The producer's increasingly frantic voice could be heard through the phone as network executives realized they were losing control of their carefully constructed narrative. Grandmother Aminata clapped her hands together with delight, finally seeing decades of suppressed truth reaching audiences across the globe. The sacred artifacts gleamed under the community center's lights, their return coinciding with the restoration of the historical record they represented. The ripple effect was beginning, spreading outward from this small room in Burkina Faso to touch continents and challenge established power structures. The comment section of Charlie's stream exploded with reactions from viewers around the world, creating a real-time global conversation about African history that had never been permitted on mainstream platforms. "Look at this," Charlie said, reading comments aloud as they scrolled past. Viewers in Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana are sharing their own family stories about broken Western promises. Ibrahim smiled as he heard familiar patterns being recognized by people who had previously felt isolated in their understanding of historical injustice. The phone continued to ring with calls from network executives, but Charlie had switched it to speaker mode, allowing the entire community to hear the panic in corporate boardrooms thousands of miles away. "They're threatening to sue me, destroy my reputation, freeze my assets," Charlie reported. But his voice carried no fear. The elders nodded knowingly, having witnessed how power structures respond when their foundational lies are exposed. The ripples were becoming waves, and the waves were becoming a tsunami of suppressed truth finally breaking free. News outlets across Africa began picking up the story, with journalists who had spent careers fighting Western narrative control suddenly finding unprecedented ammunition for their reporting. Charlie's phone displayed notifications from major African media houses requesting interviews, while his former American colleagues sent increasingly desperate messages begging him to retract his statements. "The Ghanaian Broadcasting Corporation wants to interview us live," Charlie announced, looking to Ibrahim for guidance. The captain nodded approvingly, understanding that this moment represented more than personal redemption. It was an opportunity to shift global discourse about African agency and dignity. Al Jazeera, BBC Africa, France 24 are all scrambling to cover this, Charlie continued, amazement creeping into his voice. The community center had become the epicenter of a media earthquake that was forcing international outlets to confront stories they had spent decades avoiding. The ripple effect was exposing not just Charlie's family secret, but the entire machinery of narrative suppression that had made such secrets necessary. The transformation was visible in real time as Charlie's former network began emergency damage control, issuing statements about rogue employees and unsubstantiated claims that only served to amplify the story further. "They're trying to discredit me personally instead of addressing the evidence," Charlie observed, holding up the historical documents for his viewers to see. Ibrahim took the phone and began speaking directly to the global audience, his presence lending unshakable credibility to Charlie's revelations. "This is Captain Ibrahim Traoré speaking from Burkina Faso, and I can verify that every word this young man has spoken is supported by evidence we have preserved for 6 decades. The comment stream exploded with recognition as viewers realized they were witnessing history being made by one of Africa's most respected leaders. The ripple effect had become unstoppable, transforming a personal confession into a global reckoning with suppressed truths. From this small community center in Ouagadougou, Waves of truth were washing over established narratives, forcing the world to confront uncomfortable realities about power, history, and the deliberate silencing of African voices. 6 months later, Charlie stood before the United Nations General Assembly, his transformation from media puppet to truth-teller complete. The sacred artifacts his grandfather had stolen now resided in a place of honor at the African Union headquarters, their return having sparked a global movement for historical accountability. Ibrahim sat in the diplomatic gallery, watching as his unlikely ally delivered testimony that would reshape international development policy. The systematic suppression of African narratives has not only damaged the continent, but has impoverished global understanding, Charlie declared to the assembled delegates. His former network had indeed destroyed his career, but universities across Africa had offered him positions as a researcher, documenting suppressed histories. The young man who had once been America's voice for African dependency had become Africa's advocate for historical justice. The new beginning he had chosen was difficult but authentic, trading comfortable lies for transformative truth. The impact rippled through academic institutions as scholars worldwide began revisiting decades of research built on incomplete or deliberately distorted narratives. Museums in London, Paris, and New York quietly began returning artifacts while simultaneously discovering documents that had been archived but never studied. Charlie's testimony had opened floodgates of revelation as other descendants of colonial officials came forward with their own family secrets. Ibrahim had established a Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, funded by reparations from institutions finally acknowledging their historical complicity. "We are not seeking revenge," Ibrahim had explained in interviews that now reached global audiences without editorial filtering. "We are seeking recognition that African solutions to African challenges have always existed, often despite Western interference rather than because of Western assistance." The narrative shift was fundamental, moving from patronizing charity models to respectful partnership frameworks that acknowledged African agency and expertise. In Burkina Faso, the community center where truth had first broken free had become a pilgrimage site for journalists and historians seeking to understand how suppressed stories could reshape contemporary politics. Grandmother Aminata, now in her 80s, had become an international symbol of the wisdom that survives despite attempts at historical erasure. Charlie visited monthly, his documentaries about recovered African histories winning awards and changing minds across the Western world. "The ancestors brought you here for healing," she had told him that first night, and indeed healing had occurred. Not just personal redemption, but collective restoration of dignity and agency. Ibrahim often reflected on how one moment of courage had created space for countless other truths to emerge. The elders who had preserved oral histories for decades now saw their testimonies being recorded, translated, and integrated into official historical records. The new beginning born in that community center continued expanding, creating ripples of transformation that touched every continent. The sacred artifacts returned to their proper home had sparked a renaissance of cultural pride and historical awareness throughout West Africa. Charlie's journey from propagandist to advocate had inspired others to examine their own roles in perpetuating harmful narratives. Ibrahim's leadership had proven that authentic African voices, when finally heard without distortion, could offer solutions that benefited not just the continent, but the entire global community. The broken promises of 1960 had finally been acknowledged, creating space for new agreements built on mutual respect rather than paternalistic assumptions. "Truth delayed is not truth denied," Ibrahim often said in interviews, his quiet confidence providing a model for leadership that prioritized integrity over image. The community's patience had been rewarded with justice, their wisdom finally receiving the global platform it had always deserved. From that first evening under the baobab tree, When two worlds collided in unexpected honesty, a new chapter in African-Western relations had begun. One built on truth rather than convenient fictions, on partnership rather than patronage, on recognition of shared humanity rather than manufactured hierarchy. The silence that powerful networks tried to maintain for 60 years was finally shattered by one man's courage to choose truth over comfort. Ibrahim Traoré's unwavering dignity helped transform a guilty confession into global awakening. What do you think about these revelations? Subscribe and share your thoughts below.